to the pulpit.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me into this space this morning. As I've been sitting here in the front row, listening to everything and preparing a little bit for my time with you this morning, I am really just reinvigorated by the commitment to justice and equity that occupies this space. Over the last couple weeks, in my role as executive director, the organizations I support have had to navigate a lot of really challenging information coming to them about the attacks on the rights of our LGBTQ neighbors, birthright citizenship that is also leading to ICE raids around the country, attacks on the citizenship of our indigenous neighbors and their ties to their ancestral homelands, and you know, attacks on like the actual, our very ability to do our work in the homelessness response system because of our connection to equity and justice. And so to be in a space that is so committed to that work is just really inspiring. I felt myself tearing up just at the very beginning because those attacks are so real. And it has some really, really widespread and severe consequences for our communities and our neighbors. And so thank you for your commitment to justice and to equity in this space. Like was said, my name is Chandler Esslinger, and I'm the executive director for the FM Coalition to End Homelessness. I've been in this position for 2 months today. But I have had a lifelong commitment to preventing and ending homelessness. And so the mission of the coalition is really that we work in partnership to achieve permanent solutions to prevent and end homelessness, ultimately making it rare, brief, and one time. We've been around since 1989, and I'm gonna look in the camera. If Lori Baker's on right now, I wanna say a big hello to our former coalition director. She's much more intimately kind of aware of the history of the coalition, but in 1989, the Fargo-Moorhead area, as well as actually the state of North Dakota, our entire region, was seeing an increase in homelessness, especially unsheltered homelessness. And so many different organizations came together to commit to a pathway towards ending homelessness. And we have gotten closer and further away from that goal kind of over the years. And so today, in thinking about what I wanted to share with you all, I'll talk a little bit more about the work that we do, a little bit more about what we're seeing here in the Fargo-Moorhead area, but I also would really invite discussion. I'd love to answer questions or just hear about what your concerns are in the community. So as I'm sharing, please consider kind of what has been rattling around in your brain about your concerns for our community and just maybe things that you wish you had a better understanding of. So I suppose I'll start kind of thinking more about what we've seen recently in our community. So I'll start kind of a little bit more towards the beginning of when data started being collected on homelessness. I'm really data driven in my role. When we're talking about homelessness, it's so important that we don't forget the individual lives and people and families who are touched by homelessness and who experience it much longer than they should. And at times, when we focus so much on the individual or the family, I think we can lose sight of the fact that homelessness is a result of policy and system failures. These are not individual people's failures. They are left to navigate consequences of systems that have failed to care for them. And so I'd like to keep us kind of at that systems level perspective to help us kind of unpack why we see this in our community the way that we do, recognizing, of course, that the experience of homelessness is a deeply personal one. So data on homelessness really began being comprehensively collected nationally in 2007. This was right before the big housing crisis, and we saw kind of a continued explosion of homelessness across the nation. However, through some really intentional policies around ensuring that people had access to housing and the supportive services they need, over time, we actually saw a decrease in homelessness. In about 2014, 2015, homelessness nationally had actually decreased by about 7%. But as you may all know, since 2016, homelessness has been on the rise nationally once again. And most recently, reports from the federal government tell us that homelessness has increased by 18%, which is the largest year-to-year increase we've ever seen over those last almost 20 years of data collection. And it's certainly something that we're seeing here in the Fargo-Moorhead area as well. I think one of the things that we understand most acutely about our community at this time is that we are seeing rates of unsheltered and chronic homelessness like we've never seen before in our community. Although unsheltered homelessness has always been with us, and unsheltered homelessness really being people who are forced to sleep outside because there is nowhere else for them to go. On any given night in the Fargo-Moorhead area, we have about 320 shelter beds that are available. And so what that tells us is not only do we not have adequate shelter space for individuals experiencing homelessness, but we also aren't seeing people move out of homelessness quickly and into a more permanent, stable housing situation. And so what we end up with is really this kind of level of system overwhelm, where the number of people who are seeking services, who are working to change their situation, are not being met with the adequate resources to help them move out of that situation. We have incredible providers who make up the membership of the coalition who succeed in preventing and ending homelessness every single day. And yet the need for those services, the need for that support in our community just far outweighs the availability. I have been really fortunate as I've stepped into my role to learn about the successes and the challenges that our community organizations are facing. And again, they do truly incredible work. I'll share just a couple of statistics from our local organizations with you all that help me really contextualize and understand the need that we're seeing in our community. So for example, Lakes and Prairies Community Action, a beloved community action agency on the Moorhead side, succeeded in housing and keeping housed over 1,000 households in 2024. And I know, that's incredible. And they also share with us that of all the families and individuals that present for them for service, they can only help 25% of the people who come to them. Sobering statistics. We also know that housing is the solution to homelessness. We need to ensure that there are enough places for people to live. The YWCA of Cass Clay over the last 5 years has increased their housing availability by over 60 units. They provide shelter and housing to over 350 women and children nightly. And we still know that there are families who are living unsheltered in our community as well. So, you know, there are just so many incredible points of progress, points of opportunity, and yet we're still facing a really significant crisis. So again, if we think about how housing is the solution to homelessness, we also need to know and recognize how much our community is growing. And at the same time that our community is growing, the investment in affordable housing is really dwindling, and the naturally occurring affordable housing that we have had is going away. And so I think a lot about, again, this from a systems level perspective. In the Fargo-Moorhead area, we are facing over the next 5 to 10 years a shortage of 17,000 housing units. 12,000 of those units will need to be for families who make $50,000 or less. When we consider what affordable is, that usually means it's about 30% of your monthly income going to your housing. And if you're making $50,000 a year and you're trying to match that with the rental amounts that exist in our community right now, the math does not add up. And so it's going to take a significant investment in housing to ensure that we even have enough places for people to live in our community. Again, so people are being kind of squeezed out of their housing based on their individual vulnerabilities that they may have because they're not being adequately supported by our community, by the programs that exist. And again, not because those programs don't want to support people. They do great work every day, but they're not being adequately resourced to meet that demand. So I think it's really important for us to think about this from a systems level perspective. There are a couple other kind of unique data points about our community that help us understand why we see this increasing rate of homelessness the way that we do. Many of you may or may not know, maybe renters yourselves. In Fargo specifically, almost 50% of the people who live in Fargo are renters. And almost 50% of those renters are cost-burdened renters, meaning that they are paying more than 30% of their monthly income towards their housing. And what we know is that when you are a cost-burdened renter, when you have to pay so much more to afford your place to live, that puts you at risk of homelessness, right? And so those are some of the factors that we're seeing in our community that are really leading us to this crisis. So as I think about my role at the coalition, the things that I want to do are support our partner organizations in achieving their missions, serving the niche populations that they are really good at serving, whether that's women and children fleeing domestic violence, whether that's individual males who are trying to navigate back to a place of stability, whether that's people who are dealing with chronic mental health or substance use issues who still need access to shelter and deserve a place of safety and security. But also thinking a lot about how we can work to really identify some specific goals, some iterative goals that we can achieve over time. And when I was in conversation with Lori Baker, kind of as I was interested in this position, oftentimes when we're talking about homelessness, there's a desire to try to find the most oh gosh, can't think of the word I want to use, but maybe kind of the perfect example of somebody who's deserving of help, right? Somebody that it's really easy to care about. That might be a family with young children, people who are just seen as more worthy of our support. And what that means in our community is that we continue to see these specific populations of people who have greater challenges being left behind. Meaning we see more people stay homeless longer, especially folks who are struggling with some of those mental health and substance use issues. They're not always the target population of people. And if we don't really focus on the folks who are living unsheltered in our community, the folks who are experiencing chronic homelessness, who have been homeless for a very long time, we will never be able to create a system that supports the entire continuum of people experiencing homelessness. If we continue to just focus on one particular population, we won't ever get there. And so what I've worked really hard on as I've stepped into my role is a partnership with the United Way of Cass Clay to shift the way we're thinking about what it takes to prevent and end homelessness in our community. And that really is by starting with the folks who are most vulnerable, the people who are most likely to die outside, the people who are less likely to be served by the continuum of agencies in our community. And so that means starting with the folks who are currently unsheltered, and it also means starting with the folks who are chronically homeless. You may hear, likely maybe even often in this congregation, a rising tide lifts all boats. When we prioritize the people who have the highest number of barriers to securing and maintaining permanent housing, we actually make it easier for everyone to do that. And so that's really my goal, is thinking about how do we reprioritize maybe some of the ways we've attempted to end homelessness in our community, focus on those populations of people who really need a big lift so that everybody else who just maybe needs a smaller lift is benefiting from that system of support as well. Okay. I am not super comfortable monologuing for a very long time. And so I really do want to invite some conversation from the congregation. I have it on pretty good authority that you are a very engaged congregation and also a congregation that's very committed to this issue. So hopefully I've been able to share like a little bit about my perspective on what we're seeing in our community and how we are really trying to refocus the mission of the coalition to ensure that it's benefiting all of our community members. Yeah, I'll pause there. I'm sure there are questions.
Bill, if we could start with Lori Baker had a question. I thought we should start with her question since Chandler was just talking about Lori. Lori says, Chandler, do you see a lot of immigrant/refugees or undocumented people? Does PIT count them? And is medical bankruptcy still a big factor?
Yeah, so that's a great question, Lori. Thank you. And hello again. So it's interesting. So one of the things that the national kind of report on homelessness mentioned that was really driving this increase, this 18% increase that we've seen across the country, was the level of immigration. And although we are seeing a little bit of that in our community, it is certainly not the only reason why we're seeing this big increase here in the Fargo-Moorhead area. That being said, one of the things we know that has happened due to some of the recent executive orders is that people are really afraid to try to access any type of assistance, whether they're documented, undocumented, or just maybe perceived as someone who could potentially be undocumented. And so that's really scary. And we know that families are seeking out kind of non-traditional shelter sources because of that. So families that would maybe feel really comfortable going to a Y or Churches United or somewhere like that are trying to access other parts of the shelter system so they won't be kind of targeted by any ICE raids. So that's kind of an unfortunate factor. I don't think I've got all of the, it was a multi-part question, medical debt. Yes, so there are so many different kind of individual factors, individual vulnerabilities that cause people to fall into homelessness. Medical debt is a huge part of this. Many communities who have been seen success kind of across the world in preventing and ending homelessness have socialized healthcare. That shouldn't come as a shock to anybody. It is a huge factor in terms of someone not being able to afford to pay their rent anymore. A lot of times when we talk about how families try to balance budgets, try to make all of their, make ends meet, a lot of times we'll say rent eats first. You pay your rent first and everything else comes after. Well, if you've got this really significant medical debt, perhaps your wages are being garnished, all these different things, you don't have the ability to make sure you have a place to live first. And so that is absolutely one of the things that is a challenge. I think the other thing about medical debt, it's not just medical debt, it's about being in the hospital for longer than you plan to be, especially if you don't have a place of employment that really supports your ability to regain your health. We'll see people who have some sort of major health complication, they lose their job, they lose their apartment, and then all of a sudden they're leaving the hospital and they're discharging to the street because they have nowhere else to go. So that's kind of another factor that influences that rate of homelessness as well. Did I miss anything, Abby? Okay.
This is a wonderful topic. Thank you.
Is it on? There you go.
Thank you for sharing this topic with us. Where have the homeless campers gone? And what kind of services are they now receiving?
Yeah, thank you for that question. One of the things that the city of Fargo-Cast Public Health was able to stand up was some temporary winter warming operations. Most of the folks who had been living outside have decided to come inside and try to access either a shelter bed or these winter warming operations. And actually, the whole shelter system, since I've started working in this position, has been meeting twice a week to ensure that every single shelter bed is filled every night. And we're also making sure that people are in kind of the most appropriate location for their specific needs. And kind of the target population that they make up. So many of the folks who've been sleeping outside have come into winter warming at Fargo-Cast Public Health, which is a facility, it's like a 60-chair facility on 13th and 25th in the former kind of police satellite station that was over there that has been unoccupied for several years. It is not a perfect solution. for supporting people who have been experiencing unsheltered homelessness. And the top priority in setting up that facility was ensuring that no one had to be outside and risk exposure of frostbite or death due to that. And so many of those folks have come inside. I also work really closely with the Public Health Harm Reduction Mobile Outreach Team. They are working every day with the folks who are still living along the river. There are folks who have been living along the river throughout this entire winter. And they also face kind of some specific barriers that have kept them outside. And a lot of times that's having pets. There are very few places that allow you to bring your pets inside with you. And so that's another challenge that we need to address in the community. So many folks have come in, but we do have kind of a small contingency of people who are living outside. As I mentioned earlier, kind of the priority goals over the next, between now and the end of April and the end of March and the end of April, when camping will be banned in Fargo. We're really thinking about, there's about 50 people who are staying in winter warming who, once those overflow operations cease, are going to be likely looking to sleep outside once again. And so how do we make sure that we're, as a community, planning for that potential increase in unsheltered homelessness and moving those folks directly into permanent housing? And so that's what I'm focused on right now, is problem solving not only for the folks who are still sleeping outside, trying to get them connected to the housing and support services they need, but also planning for that potential increase in unsheltered homelessness as well. So not a perfect answer.
One more question, and then can you stick around and come downstairs? for
Yeah,
people
I'd be
ask you
happy
more?
to, yes.
Okay, all right, great.
You mentioned a shortage both in shelter beds and in housing. Which one is the more critical in our community? And one other simple addition to this. Blue Sky is a path from shelter bed to permanent housing. Is it working, and do we need more of that?
Absolutely, thank you for the question. So shelter is a critically important intervention in our community. Shelter absolutely saves people's lives. However, in any community like ours where we have limited resources, we do not want to continue to invest more and more resources in temporary solutions. The thing that we're dealing with right now is that the number of shelter beds that we have in our community should be enough. There should be enough shelter beds in our community to meet demand. But because people are not moving out of shelter and into permanent housing, we're seeing people stay in shelter longer than they ever should, almost being sentenced to a life in shelter and then eventually a life on the street, because you cannot stay in shelter for forever. And so we really do need to be focusing on those pathways out of shelter into permanent housing. Bright Sky is a great example of that. Each individual operation has strengths and weaknesses. That's the nature of nonprofit work, especially in a pervasively underfunded sector of nonprofit work that has largely been viewed as charity and not really an investment in people's human rights. And so really thinking about, again, not just a temporary shelter solution, which is critical, but maximizing the resources we do have to build those pathways to permanent housing is the way we will end homelessness in our community.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.